to our topic hosted conference on effective pronunciation feedback, because as you know, teachers of pronunciation are what? Tops. And participants, if you don't mind, please introduce yourself in the chat. You can put your name. You can tell whether you're a member or a guest if you like, if you're a teacher or a student, maybe if you'd like to include your workplace or who you work with, or even what country, what state, what city you are logging in from. If you're teaching a pronunciation class per se, or if you are trying to infuse pronunciation into your program, any of those things, which would be cool for us to be able to see what's going on with our group here. So we're going to make this an interactive session. We'll start out with a few things, and while you are typing in the chat, you'll see that your top leadership is here. I'm Marsha Chan. And there's Randy Rightmire.
Hi, everybody. I'm Marsha's co-coordinator and sidekick.
Yes. And our third sidekick is Patryk Mrozek.
Hello, everyone.
Some of you are members, many of you are members, and you already reap these benefits of our vibrant community in California. And we, of course, are involved in teaching English to speakers of other languages. You have the option to get to the publication CATESOL Journal, which comes out twice a year. We have monthly or even more CATESOL update announcement that tell what exciting events are going on. The conference is coming up in September, the state conference, which is a grand event. After the pandemic, we're actually getting together face to face. We also offer members discounts to our conferences and events. We have free access to any number of interest groups, levels, and chapters within the organization. You have an opportunity to interact, to network, to learn, to teach with other members of CATESOL, both at conferences face-to-face and on these virtual events like we're doing right now. Online discussions with like-minded professionals on the message boards. You have access to the job bank if you're looking for employment. You have access to scores of recorded webinars from our last couple of years of online professional development. And you have opportunities for awards and grants for both teachers and students. Okay, well, let's talk a little bit today about giving effective pronunciation feedback. And so we have a couple of questions we were brainstorming, and I'd like you to keep those things in mind because we're going to let you discuss these topics from your point of view and see what we can share with each other. This is our general outline. We're going to be talking about effective feedback for learners, feedback for intelligibility in pronunciation, and a little bit about automatic feedback for self-study. And then we're going to have the participant engagement. So in terms of feedback for learning, we are talking about feedback. So what is feedback? It's information about how a learner is doing in relation to a target or a goal. So you want to tailor that basically toward the goal of your class or your learning curriculum, or what the learner needs to do in terms of meeting that goal. And feedback differs from praise. Wow, you're doing a great job. That was good. And it differs from assessment in terms of, well, this course is formative assessment, which we are more likely to find helpful in terms of doing the feedback. And there's also kind of feedback which gives people grades, which, maybe some of you just finished doing with your semester ending. And it differs from advice, but many times the feedback is followed by some of these other elements. And feedback is effective if it occurs during the learning process while the learner has time to act on it. In other words, it has to be timely in order for the learner to hear what he or she has done or said or written, or how they've acted, in order to hear that feedback and connect it with next steps. I think it's really important too to provide a really safe place to make mistakes. right? So that a learner doesn't feel like they're being targeted, but they're feeling like, oh, okay, so I learned something about what I didn't do correctly, and I can absorb that, I can receive that, and move on to make something better. Meaningful feedback informs, it educates, and as mentioned before, it references a particular skill or a particular knowledge. And if we're talking about pronunciation, the skill may be in understanding how to position the mouth or how to breathe or listening to different intonation patterns or knowledge that are certain patterns, like compound nouns have a certain pattern, right? So these are things that can help the student remember and learn from things that you are teaching them. Is given sooner than later, so there's a connection with the action and what may be considered to be repair or advancement. It addresses the learner's advancement toward a goal. So if the learner wants to speak more clearly, speak more fluently, speak more confidently, then whatever feedback you give the student can help project them along that goal. And it's presented carefully. In other words, that the learner doesn't feel attacked. The learner feels, ah, a washover of this type of information or this kind of feedback can help the learner feel comfortable so they desire to move forward. And it involves the learner in the process. So the feedback goes to the learner and the learner can absorb it and then make some further changes to go in a forward direction. And as you know, feedback can be given in a lot of different ways. A lot of times we talk about it being verbally, which really means orally, like we say it to the student, especially if we are in pronunciation class or oral communication class. Sometimes we'll do it directly with the student, either face-to-face or online in a virtual situation. Sometimes we do it when a student makes a recording, and then we make a recording to give some feedback to the students. Sometimes we do it by writing down some notes in written form, and other times we just do it non-verbally. We just show our face, or we make gestures with our body or our facial expression with our hands and so forth. So those are different ways that as teachers we can give feedback to our learners. Now, Lister and Ranta identified 6 types of corrective feedback. So there's explicit correction, and that's where you actually tell a student how to correct something and how to say it again in a different way. If they have said something not correctly, then you can actually tell them what to do. All right, lower your tongue a little bit more. Instead of saying pen, say hand. So that might be considered a type of explicit correction with modeling involved. And if you do something like a recast, a student may make a sentence with some grammatical or phonological error in it, and you can repeat the idea, right? You basically reiterate the student's idea, but you say it in a correct way. So, if, for example, if my mom very liked peaches. Oh, your mom likes peaches very much. I like peaches very much too. So it's another way to kind of repeat the idea that you understood what the learner was saying. Now, sometimes you have to do a clarification request because you really don't understand what you heard, right? And sometimes we do it kind of in a fake way. And I mean, we ask that question, but we do it because we want the student to consider cognitive changes of ways, oh, what did I say? And how should I say it differently? So maybe it could be a possibility of either one, right? So if the student says to you, I see you on Thursday, you might want to ask, do you mean Tuesday or Thursday? That would be one example of asking for clarification. So Metalistic feedback, you don't exactly give them the answer or the correct way of saying. You might give them a fill in the blank kind of a thing. So you're maybe somebody mispronounces a word if it's phonological. My mom very like bitches. Your mother likes, hmm? And then they might think about it and think, oh, peaches. Yeah, we learned about it and E. So sometimes we ask about elicitation, where you're asking a question of the learner to try to elicit some information from them. And then there's repetition. Sometimes we repeat. Do you ever repeat with a rising intonation where you're not really you're, for example, if somebody says, uh, I like chocolate, and then they remember, you taught them how to say chocolate, and they may say, that intonation question kind of makes me think of the correct pronunciation. So some of these require the student or prompts the students to respond back with a different kind of information. Now let's talk about feedback for intelligibility in pronunciation.
Thank you so much, Marsha. Yeah, so as much as there's been a lot of research done into the topic of feedback in second language education in general, especially for writing and grammar, the amount of empirical studies that focused specifically on giving feedback on pronunciation is rather limited. But we've been able to find some good ones, some evidence that shows that actually including corrective feedback in programs of pronunciation instruction greatly improves their effectiveness. The Saito and Lister study from 2012 was pretty groundbreaking in that respect. The studies that I just mentioned, they focused on segmental features, so the phonemes of a language, but actually giving corrective feedback on suprasegmental features has also been found to improve the overall intelligibility and comprehensibility of learners. What's interesting, and that has been evident in the study that was that rated Korean learners' perceptions of different minimal pairs, is that corrective feedback can also be, or especially effective in improving learners' perception of speech sounds. So their ability to discriminate between, minimal pairs and different phonemes of a language, which made Cooper right, and I think that that's very true, that since gains in perception have been shown to benefit production eventually, then we can safely say that corrective feedback ultimately helps learners to improve in both measures. Here's a couple of studies that show like what the priorities could be for giving corrective feedback on pronunciation and some guidelines for teachers. So Derwing and Monroe argue that teachers should encourage peer correction as another important source of feedback. But another study, a very recent one from 2021, actually showed that, and that's really interesting, when peer feedback is used, it more positively affects the givers of the feedback and not the receiver's speech. So by giving pronunciation feedback to other learners, learners in pronunciation programs and regular English classes can actually improve faster and make their pronunciation more effective. Again, for theoretically and empirically supported guidance, it seems that corrective feedback is more effective when the item being corrected has been previously taught. So it's so when CF follows form-focused instruction on pronunciation, And going back to what Marsha was talking about when it comes to the different types of feedback that can be given, a recent study showed that feedback types with prompts, so things like elicitation and metalinguistic feedback and clarification requests, can be more effective than just simple recasts or repetition. So we want this the students, the learners, to really think about what was quote unquote incorrect in their pronunciation and how they can use strategies to amend that. Cooper, again, in this really great article from 2018 that I'll put a reference to it in the chat later, says it best that firstly, learners need to understand there is an error, then know precisely where it is, which we can use visual support to point them in the right direction, what the error is, and then how to produce the given pronunciation feature accurately. So teachers need to explain how they hear what the learner is saying and help them to compare and contrast the difference between what they said and what they wanted to say. So I think that really shows how types of feedback that involve prompts would be more effective in getting the students to improve their pronunciation. A couple more things. Darwin and Monroe argue that corrective feedback is more effective when diagnostics are used to analyze learners' needs and guide them in setting their goals. So again, we can see a common thread here of how feedback should follow from instruction and be a part of the curriculum, informed by the needs of the students. And going back to intelligibility, which we thought was an important point to raise here in this webinar. Right now, I think the consensus in pronunciation pedagogy is that the goal that we want our learners to achieve is comfortable intelligibility, being able to communicate without the listeners having trouble understanding them, as opposed to nearing native-like pronunciation. So Levis, who actually was a guest in John Levis, who was a guest in some of our previous webinars, wrote really fantastic guidelines on teaching for intelligibility that apply both to the pronunciation goals we set and the instruction that we implement, and also the feedback that we give. And here these guidelines can answer the question of what to correct. Now that we know that we do want to correct our students' pronunciation because it will help them achieve their goals, through the intelligibility principle, we can identify errors that would warrant that sort of correction. So here we're talking about features that have an explicit connection to communication and other areas of language. So for example, features of pronunciation that are connected to grammar, like past tense endings, for example. Then second, mispronunciations that cause difficulties in processing, and here where this means listeners processing. So listeners' ability to sort of parse what the speaker is conveying. Then the pronunciation of important lexical items should be given priority over less important items. So I think what's really exciting in pronunciation teaching right now is using corpora to figure out what the most common vocabulary is in a language, and prioritizing teaching the pronunciation of those words. Then errors that carry high functional load, and functional load here is understood as, how many minimal pairs could exist between, two different phonemes of a language. So for example, the minimal pair of the and the, like the voiced and unvoiced th sounds, has a much lower functional load than, for example, the e and the I vowels. And then finally, more frequent errors are more important than less frequent errors, and features that are learnable should be prioritized over those that are not. And, because of the window for listeners or speakers' ability to learn how to pronounce certain features of a foreign language, it doesn't completely close, but in some cases, depending on the learner, there are some features that might not be 100% learnable. That brings me to a point that is not entirely research backed, but I wanted to propose that instructors should monitor and record instances of giving corrective feedback to their students to the best of their ability, because these patterns of errors can give them insight into their students' progress if these are errors with pronunciation points that have been, made part of the curriculum, and also emerging needs. So they that things that haven't really been made part of the curriculum, but we can kind of tell that the students could use some help with those sounds or aspects of pronunciation. And frequent errors that affect intelligibility, that we've found that we've been giving a lot of feedback on, then can inform the curriculum going forward with a particular group of student. And I think Randy is now going to give us a slightly deeper understanding of some of the points that I've just outlined.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. So everybody, Patrick is much more grounded in the foundational research in feedback in pronunciation teaching than I am, but I'm going to present just a few slides of some recent research articles that kind of piggyback on the foundational ideas that Marsha and Patrick presented. And I'll kind of connect back to their ideas, as well as trying to connect to my own practice as a pronunciation teacher. And I didn't put my bio in the chat, but I'll go ahead and introduce myself now. I'm Randy Rightmire, and besides being the top co-coordinator for this interest group, I'm also a lecturer at UC Santa Barbara, and I've been teaching oral skills courses there to university students. We have a few courses that we teach to undergraduate students at the university level, and we have a lot of courses that we teach to graduate students, and that's where I'm mainly involved. And some of these courses for grad students are mandatory courses for graduate teaching assistants. And so to the extent that pronunciation is an issue for an individual teaching assistant, we're going to make their course into a pronunciation course, and that's where I come in. So, the first article that I just want to present on this slide here, I'm not going to read through these pull-out quotes that you'll see on the right side, but for everybody's benefit, those who are interested, I think Patrick or Marsha is going to put the link to these slides into the chat, and you'll be able to grab it later. You'll be able to read these pull-out quotes in more detail and click on the links to these articles if you're interested. But, the main thing that I want to say on this slide is research shows that learners need to have positive perceptions about the feedback that they're getting in order for this feedback to be maximally beneficial. And, this partly overlaps with the previous point that it needs to connect to previous learning about what pronunciation skills you're exactly trying to correct here. So, in my practice, I like to begin by connecting back to something that a student may have previously learned in another lesson, or even previously in the same lesson, but just add a little bit of correction to what they're doing and say, do you remember when, or do you remember how we talked about, using high intonation versus low intonation, something like that. Research shows that if you previously teach a particular pronunciation skill, whether that is one of the segmental skills, the phonemes, as Patryk was talking about, or the suprasegmentals, which are the rhythm and the intonation patterns, whatever you've previously taught, that kind of feedback is what's going to be maximally beneficial to the learner. Individualizing feedback is found in research to be the most effective way to do that. And if you're teaching in a big class, you can find these moments to individualize feedback. In my big class practice, I like to assign students in small peer groups with the directive to give peer feedback, as Patryk was talking about earlier. But during that time, I'm able to go from group to group, floating around the room, as I know you classroom teachers know all about this. And when I'm floating around to those small groups, I'm able to individualize my feedback a lot better. Now, in my work at UCSB with graduate students, I tend to work one-on-one and in really small groups of 2 or 3 or 4 students per group. So individualizing is even more possible in those settings. But, when you have the opportunity, it's probably when a student is giving a classroom presentation in front of the group, and that's when you're hearing just that one student, and then you can give some individualized feedback there. As the class gets bigger and bigger, it becomes a little bit riskier and potentially face-threatening for a student to be corrected in front of a lot of peers. As Marsha said, we want to create a safe space. And the way that I do that in my own teaching practice is get the students involved in the kind of feedback that they're going to get. I tend to begin a course and any single day in that course by summarizing what types of feedback are going to be available to a student. Do you want instant feedback today? That's when I will interrupt you and I'll repronounce one of the words that you mispronounced. Or would you like some deferred feedback where we wait until we get to the end of your presentation and then I'll cover a couple of the main things that you missed? Or even further deferred where, I'll write these feedback corrections down and share them with you later, maybe at our next office hour meeting, or maybe I'll send them to you in an email, something where the student gets to buy into the type of feedback that they're going to receive. Now, in my experience, students almost overwhelmingly opt for the instant feedback. They feel safe in being interrupted. But I tell them the advantages and the disadvantages of these types of feedback. In the instant feedback, the interruptions will kind of tempt you to lose your flow in the presentation that you're giving. For that reason, I've had at least one student tell me that he preferred to get the deferred feedback because, keeping his flow in the middle of a presentation was one of his particular struggles. And so he didn't really see himself as being super capable in that instant feedback setting. So that's all to say that when you individualize feedback, and it could be potentially face-threatening, especially as you get into bigger class presentations, you give the students these options. Once they are involved in choosing the type of feedback that they're going to get, it's even more beneficial to the individual student. And as I said before, I really like to connect it back to something that they previously learned. The last thing that I would like to talk about is just really briefly touch on some technologies that are available for students to use in self-study. The first one, and this is kind of the most dedicated to pronunciation teaching, and that's ELSA Speak. ELSA is an IA that will analyze your pronunciation in real time, and it will know what you're trying to pronounce and give you feedback in how well you're pronouncing it. You know, a green light, a yellow light, a red light, depending on how well you're doing. And that technology, if you get the slides after this presentation, you'll see in the notes section under this slide, I've put some links to a tutorial for ELSA as well as to the download page. Now, it is a subscription service, and some people are not going to want to pay for the subscription, so there are some lower cost options. Windows speech recognition, and it's kind of rival across the aisle, Google Voice typing. Okay, these are dictation programs, and they're not dedicated just to learning pronunciation. Well, they're not dedicated at all to learning pronunciation, but they can be co-opted into a kind of tool where you'll know if your pronunciation is on or off as you watch the dictation program attempt to type what you're speaking. And so, you know, in some research, this was found to be a little bit useful, although, you know, to a certain extent, students found it frustrating because maybe the dictation capability was not quite as close as they would have wanted. But this is a low cost or zero cost option for students that already have Google Docs, which is free, or Windows, which many people already have. And then the last one, just some apps for visual feedback. So a kind of visual feedback that you may know if you did any linguistic analysis is a waveform analysis or a spectrogram. And under the notes section of this slide, for those who download the slideshow later, you'll be able to see some links to apps that you may use to help students visualize their own pronunciation, as well as to visualize a model speaker's pronunciation for purposes of visual comparison. Now, I wouldn't have necessarily put a lot of emphasis on this, but some research recently has shown that there is a little benefit in helping students master certain vowel sounds as well as certain other segmental sounds if they can see the visual difference between their own speech and a native speaker's speech. So, you know, one of the apps is called Prat or Prot. I guess that's a Dutch word. Prot is a speech analysis download, which you can get for free, but it does take a little bit of training. And there's a link in the notes under this slide to a tutorial that's not really very long to learn how to use Prot. And the similar app which I have used is Audacity. That's another free download. And among its many, many other uses, Marsha has prepared some great tutorials on the many uses of Audacity. But one of its uses is to get a spectrogram of any speech that you've recorded. So if your student recorded a sentence or even a single word, you look at the spectrogram of that speech and you can zoom in on individual portions and say, let's compare your vowel visually with that of the model native speaker. And, you know, there are many, many other uses for this visual feedback. It's just one more tool in the toolkit. Students can use this in their self-study in a homework assignment, for example. It's a little more involved than ELSA Speak, but again, it is free download. And so those are the apps. And finally, we have a Padlet. One of the ways that we use a Padlet in these discussion forums is just to see any questions that you might want to type. However, you're free to unmute yourself and just shout your question out to the group as well. By the way, we also use these Padlets to get ideas for future top IG sessions, we'd like to have a session in July and another one in August. We don't have topics yet for the months of July and August, so feel free to suggest a topic that you'd like to see covered in a future webinar, and we'd be happy to look into that. So right now I've just kind of seeded the Padlet with the few questions from our title slides. One is, should we correct our students' pronunciation? I don't know if anybody has any opinions or any experience saying whether you should or whether you shouldn't do it at all.
Hi, I'm Andy. I work with a lot of students from Vietnam and China, and I have offered a lot of feedback on my students' pronunciation. Some because sometimes it's not very clear what they're saying, but sometimes what they're saying may sound like something else. And if they take it outside of the classroom, they could get in a little bit of trouble for what they're saying. So that's when I notice things like that, especially even if it's not something that I have addressed in class, I will provide individualized feedback so they don't, so they can try to work on those things and they don't make that mistake outside of the classroom and don't feel embarrassed about it. But I don't know. I don't know if that's the right way. It's just what I've been doing, in a listening, speaking class that I teach. So
I'd like to respond to that and say that that is really very appropriate, because one of the things about giving feedback in the context of intelligibility is communication. We speak because we want to communicate, right? And others, we want them to understand us. And if we speak in a way that people who are trying to listen can't understand us, or they even misunderstand us, then we would be better off being treated like someone who learns to know the difference and to find out how to make it better. So that sounds totally appropriate to me.
Yeah, I think
Thank
it gets to the struggle that we all struggle with, which is how to prioritize, because you can only give so much feedback and a student can only use so much feedback. Patryk mentioned choosing or prioritizing those items that have a high functional load. Sometimes I will tell one of my students, I'm helping you with this particular word because you are going to use this word almost every day for the rest of your professional life if you happen to be in the field that you're in. And Andy, you talked about words that could get students into trouble, but I'm not sure what kind of trouble you mean.
words that are not so appropriate to be saying in public.
Like, I'm going to take this sheet of paper
Yeah.
and I'm going
Things
to
like
read it
that.
down on the beach because it's so beautiful down on the beach. Yeah, I don't know if, Patryk might know this better than I do, if some of the research has talked about social appropriateness as counting under the category of functional load, or if that's its own category.
I don't know. I haven't really come across any research on those words in particular, but I think that the beach minimal pair, that is a high functional load pair for other reasons too. But anecdotally, or just like from my experience, I found that there's actually not that many. I think the B word is one of them, and then important is another one that's been thrown around as possibly being pronounced as something inappropriate. But there's actually not that many words in the English language that are minimal pairs with something really, with a swear word. So I
Yeah.
think it's funny, but it's not really something that we would need to have, you know, a dedicated course to address.
Focus can be a problem.
Oh yeah, for French as
Oh,
a
fuck.
first language speakers.
And
Oh yeah,
Spanish.
focus.
Focus, very bad.
Yeah, let's make sure we have that in context.
Right.
I was going to add, Andy, I think, you know, what you're doing is, like Marsha said, absolutely appropriate. But I also think that it's really the first step towards helping them. And then, you know, if you find that these students have been making similar mistakes over and over again, or with the same sound or in those same words, then it might be useful to you know, do an impromptu lesson, or I mean a planned, of course, but like actually address those issues with your instruction, and have the
Yeah.
students look at other contexts in which this sound is being used.
Can I ask just one more question? It's really quick. So one of the words that I noticed, and the students were talking about the vertebrae, the discs, and they switch. Instead of saying disc, they say dicks. Yeah, dicks,
Mm.
dicks,
Yeah, my
dick.
dick is
I'm
broken.
like, okay. So what is that when they switch those consonants, the place? How do I
Yeah.
approach that?
I would say it's an issue with consonant clusters, which is big for a lot of speakers of Mandarin and Vietnamese. So if you were to consult a textbook on how to teach that, I'd go with, like, the keyword here would be consonant clusters.
Thank you.
One of the comments on the Padlet, I'll just point it out now, under the category of when and how do we point out errors, you know, how do we prioritize which ones to point out? The comment is when they interfere with communication, especially if the rest of the class heard the mispronunciation. I don't know if anybody has any personal experience about that. Watching the class or getting the class to participate in hearing and pointing out errors. Most of the time that classmates tend to help with pointing out errors is indirectly, you know, in a really organic type of feedback or indirect feedback, which is just to misunderstand something. And when it becomes clear that one person or everybody misunderstood a key word in the presentation, that's how do we identify that? I mean, how do you address that? I don't know if anybody has any experience doing that. Andy, do you have anything like that?
My students give a lot of presentations in my class, but everything is done via Zoom nowadays. And because of a lot of internet problems and things like that, I ask students to pre-record their presentations. So the classmates provide feedback. Sometimes I give them a rubric of things to look for, and then I offer individualized feedback. I record my feedback and I focus on things that after I see what the other students said, oh, I didn't understand this, I didn't understand that. I gather what they said and with what I observed, and I try to, you know, make it more individualized for each student. But it's because it's pre-recorded, it's not a live thing. We're not doing that, you know, in person. And yeah, again, you know, it's just how things have evolved. But that's how I do it now via Zoom.
When I'm teaching on Zoom, I find it's really helpful to give written feedback and just type things into the Zoom chat, or if I'm typing them down in my notes during a student's presentation, I might copy and paste that into the chat a little bit later when I'm coming back to that and giving them some specific coaching on a word or a sound or anything that it is. The Zoom chat is a really helpful different channel that we can use.
There's a question in the chat about how do we use corpora. I would say one of the things for us as teachers to become more aware of corpora. What is a corpus and what does it do for us? So a corpus is a body. That's what corp is, right? It's a body of words and words that are used. And the first corpuses were made corpuses or corpora. They looked at written works because it's so much easier for machines to analyze written text and then put them together, but they're also spoken corpora. So we actually have an interest group that is called the CIRT.
Corpus Informed
Corpus
Research and
Informed.
Teaching Interest Group.
Thank you. Corpus Informed Research and Teaching. So this is a good place if you're interested in learning more about the different corpora that will be like Corpus of American English or British English or all kinds of English in different domains. Then you can find out which words are more important in terms of their frequency and usage. You can also find out how words are put together in certain phrase sets and phrases, and that can be very informative. For example, as a writer, as a textbook writer with a number of books, I have used corpora extensively to determine which words, what kind of phrasing to use in our model paragraphs and so forth, in our conversation models and so forth, in order to help learners hear and practice things that are more common instead of less common, right? So those sorts of things help to inform us. For example, we know at the phoneme level that the schwa vowel is the most common vowel, right? And that's not something that we are taught in school as kids, because we have to learn to read in school, right? When we're 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, we're learning to read, and we have the sound symbol correspondence. So there's a wholly different goal. It assumes that we kind of already know how to speak and listen, but for our non-native learners of English, they don't have that background, and we have to really distinguish. So this stuff is phonics and spelling and reading and writing, and this stuff is oral listening and speaking, because as you know, in English, there's not a good match as there is in some other languages where the sound symbol correspondence is much greater in terms of phonemes. So in the way of phonemes, then we learn from corpora that it's more important to teach the listening and speaking and production of it than the th. Well, I mean, a lot of people want to use the th because it's so English, right? It's one of the unique features of the English language compared to many other languages. But we learned that it's very low on the threshold in terms of what's really important in distinguishing words. So in that way, corpora can help us as teachers determine which of those errors we should focus on and which we can leave to, like if somebody is at a very, very, very fluent level and you're working on honing their accent, as opposed to trying to make them overall more intelligible.
Yeah, if I can jump onto the back of that, Marsha, I think what you're saying is, in part, what you're saying is you can use corpora to demonstrate which words are really frequent, which phrases are really frequent in the language as it's actually used, and thereby identify which phrases really need to be learned or which phrases, need to be mastered, or there's a little more importance in mastering those words and phrases. And I think it's kind of individual too for students who are specializing in a certain work area, or scholars who are researching in a certain field. They have their own vocabulary that's really important for them. And so all of this kind of overlaps a little bit with a really interesting question that's on the Padlet, and I'm going to read that question now. How do we address students' perceptions about pronunciation being less important than every other aspect of oral skills or presentations. And this is, of course, when you're teaching pronunciation as part of an oral skills course. You want to teach pronunciation and they don't want to learn pronunciation, or you want to teach it a little more than they think is important. This happens to me, especially when students have a little bit of importance on their segmental pronunciation, because they're kind of aware of the errors that they make in vowels and consonants, or the difficulty they have in that area. And they're not at all concerned about rhythm or intonation or other supra-segmental aspects, which we find to be much, much more important in carrying on conversations or carrying meaning in presentations. So, I run against that all the time. And this comment on the Padlet goes on, when these goals are slightly at odds, the teacher may be viewed as nativist, in other words, sort of prejudiced towards native speakers, or prejudiced even towards your own accent, towards American English versus other varieties of world English, okay? So the question is, how do we address that? One of the answers, I think, could be with corpora saying, look, these are the really, really frequent phrases that come up so much more often than other phrases in texts, whether it's in general or whether it's in your field. But that's just part of the answer. I don't know if others have more to add to answer this question.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in here. This is a really interesting question. Thank you for posing it. And I like that it mentions TED, because I do work with a lot of students who are inspired by TED Talks and really proficient presenters. And I think what I've found to work with that sort of really advanced level student is focusing on the keyword here would be impact. And I try to raise their awareness of how proficient speakers use certain features, especially suprasegmental features of pronunciation, for additional impact on their audience. So we talk about things like we'll watch these TED Talks, and I'll show them, this what this speaker just said. If I was just having a conversation with someone, I'd probably divide it into only one or two thought groups. But this speaker uses 3 or 4 thought groups and separates their ideas more to add, so that they can have more prominent focus words and speak more impactfully. And we look at these, so it starts with listening for me, and connecting the way the speakers convey their message through prominence and thought groups, and how that affects the impactfulness of their message. Same with, for example, intonation going down at ends of sentences. I lived in LA for 10 years. So when I have conversations with my friends, I use upspeak. But if I'm in a professional context giving a presentation, I'm going to make sure that after I make an important point, the pitch of my voice goes confidently down.
That reminds me about feedback to sort of gender-based patterns in oral skills, and how to not, I guess, pigeonhole people into a certain expected pattern, but they need to have that valuable feedback at some point. I don't think we're helping our students by ignoring patterns, whether it's a personal impediment or like a gender-based one, because we know that our female students tend to have the upspeak and other qualities in their production that don't necessarily, we're not helping them by not pointing them out.
I can jump in and add a little bit more, staying on the topic of this question of how we can get students to assign importance to pronunciation feedback. And I'll share a problem that I used to have and a sort of solution that I worked out for it. One problem used to be I would ask a student at the beginning of a presentation, okay, what is the skill that you're most going to try to improve in today's presentation? And all too often I would get something like, I'm going to try to improve eye contact or body language. And I'm thinking, okay, that's great. But eventually you need to move on from there because your pronunciation has a lot of errors. And I don't know if anybody's ever pointed that out to you, but we need to work on that. Or a related problem that used to happen is I would give a student a video of their last presentation and say, analyze this video and tell me, what do you see that you'd like to improve? So what goals do you want to set for your next presentation based on your analysis of this video? And invariably, or at least too often, the student would come back and say, it seems like I say a lot. So I want to get rid of And so I would, want that student to be a lot more connected to the pronunciation teaching that is a component of that course, and just absorbing that and applying that to analysis of their own speech and setting their own goals. So here's the way that I work around that. I don't ask that question in quite the same way anymore. At the beginning of a presentation, I might say instead, what is a piece of feedback that you got last week or yesterday, whenever it was, that you've been working on to improve? Or what piece of feedback have you recently received that you'd like to try to improve in today's presentation? And in that way, the student really connects back to previous learning and also gets a lot more focused on things that kind of align with the course goals, with the pronunciation components of a course that they're taking. So that's my workaround. And does it work? Well, I do get students to provide a lot more details than to say, I'm going to get rid of or I'm going to use more eye contact. They really do seem to connect back to the previous learning and previous feedback. Sometimes it's feedback that they got from a classmate, and very often it's feedback that they got from me or some skill that I taught in a previous lesson.
Yeah, that kind of questioning, Randy, really helps the learner engage their brain and think, right? Not just feel like they're holding the cup out and you're supposed to pour stuff into it and they drink from it. They really have to search back and get some brain cells going about what they have done in the past and how to reflect on that. So it's a lot about reflection, as well as understanding how the feedback that they have received from you or from others can help propel them toward, in a particular direction, to speak more clearly in this case. If your students are, of course, you're working with really highly advanced fluent students, so it's easier to get that kind of thought process and ability to express. That's much more possible in your teaching situation than probably in some others here, where if we're working with students whose proficiency level is low, they won't even have the words to say it, right? So it'll be different once I see some heads nodding, and you might be feeling, yeah, how could we possibly do that? They don't have the language.
But there are always going to be these highly proficient students who think that they want to be a TED speaker or speak like a TED speaker, and those are the skills that they think they need to work on. Those are the goals that they have for their own speech. But they may not think pronunciation is very important until they hear somebody like Patryk point out, what about prominence? What about, why does the speaker pause after that word? Why does the speaker slow down on that phrase? Why do you think they're using a down intonation instead of an up intonation. So in those cases where the student can focus on prosodic features for impact, then maybe, as you were saying, Patryk, maybe they can identify pronunciation as one of the ways they can become impactful like a TED speaker.
I feel like you can also go down the practicality route. Like if you focus more on pronunciation, you'll be repeating yourself less in conversations. You'll be paraphrasing less or rephrasing. And like you guys said, you'll have more impact and you'll be able to convey tone better.
There's another question on the Padlet. As most of us have also been language learners, we know when oral corrective feedback has been very effective and memorable. What were the conditions surrounding this feedback? And I love learning languages. It's like my main hobby. So I wanted to talk about this. I think for me, the key difference, and that goes back to what we're saying about how the feedback has to be sort of rooted in instruction. But the key difference for me, like the feedback that I think I've really benefited from was one where I clearly, like I knew exactly like what I did wrong and how I could adjust it towards a correct model. So, you know, I didn't find the teachers who just repeated something to me and were like, say it the way I do, helpful at all. Like I think my pronunciation in English, for example, improved only when I learned the theory behind where my tongue is supposed to be, or you know how I can, like also with visuals, basically. When my instructors would point out the mechanics of what it is that I need to be doing, as opposed to like, no, this is wrong, this is how you say it, right? Maybe someone else would want to share their experience on being corrected when they were learning a second language.
I had to learn English as an adult. My first language is Portuguese. And I didn't get a lot of pronunciation correction, but I did get correction on other things such as prepositions. And it was always helpful. And that person was always my mother-in-law telling me, oops, yeah, it's not on the sink, it's in the sink. You know, it was, I know what in and on is, obviously, but it was helpful to hear that from someone who noticed it and who was pointing it out. Sometimes it embarrasses me. Sometimes it frustrates me that I still can't get the right, the right preposition, for example, in a different instance. But I think it's, sometimes it will interrupt the flow, like someone mentioned here before. And if it's a presentation, for example, I try not to do that to my students because I feel like it will disrupt what they're doing. They prepared so much for this, you know, and now if I say it, maybe they will be too nervous and they can't really go back to what they're saying. So it depends on the, on the situation, I think. Maybe in a non-classroom environment, it may be less, what did you say, face-threatening kind of thing. But I do agree with you, as an adult learner, I think it's important to have that pointed out to you and not just like recast. That to me feels like it's more like patronizing as a little bit, you know, but that's just my experience. I think we're all different and we may appreciate different things when learning a new language.
I wrote that comment about, you know, when did we have this effective feedback? And I'm thinking of one specific grammar correction that came from an in-law, sister-in-law, in learning Spanish. And I think the relationship of trust and the fact that she was listening and again, pointing out something that was just so repetitive and so fundamentally wrong, which is the difference between it takes me this long or I take. And the fact that she gave me that correction, it is one of the errors I will always remember and never make a mistake with. But I think it has to do with the calm and the trust that I had with her. And I've had plenty of Spanish teachers who didn't listen to me carefully enough to point that out, or very little tailored correction. So there's something about the calm and the quiet and the closeness that we have with pronunciation students. I would hope that happens in my classes. I don't know.
I think what you're saying is, I agree with you, but I also think that sometimes we have so many students, right, that we can't just focus on everybody and everything that they're doing. I wish I could. I wish they would come to my office hours so I could do what you said, and I have even heard colleagues, I'm sorry, discouraging us from providing feedback on their pronunciation. So it's iffy sometimes. I don't know. That's why I'm here. I would love to hear from more people. Sorry, I live with many people in this house, so it gets noisy.
No worries. You're doing a great job. You're going with the flow, so to speak. So thanks for that. I think what's been touched on a lot here is actually sort of the empathetic feeling, would you say? Setting up that atmosphere where you as a teacher can understand how, or you try to empathize with a particular learner. And the fact of the matter is, when you have a classroom of students, they don't all have the same level of confidence or trust. And as a teacher, we're kind of always gauging, if we want to reach student A, you can do this. And if you want to reach student B, you have to do this. And you can't always do the same thing to every student because they don't react that way, right? Some are feel more tender and they need more gentleness. And others, you can, they're just ready to trot and you can tell them anything. And so it's a kind of a dance, I would say, if you want to work with your students to do this. I'll give you an example of a time when I was not the teacher. I just happened to be among a group of people. And it was a group of people who were international graduate students at UC Berkeley. That's where I grew up. My sister used to work in that realm with foreign students and scholars. And there was a time when we had a gathering, and there was one gentleman from Poland who knew that I was an ESL teacher. And he came to me and he said, I want you to correct me every time I make an error, right? I really want to get this. And so he was the type of guy who said, his idea was I could bust in any old time and correct him and tell him how to do it and not, what mistake he made. And he was so happy with that. But it really made other people uncomfortable. And my sister told me, why are you picking on so-and-so? Because her perception was that I was critical of that person's speech. And so I had to explain to her that he had specifically asked me to do that, and he was happy with the result. But you can see that people have different feelings about being corrected or hearing feedback that shows that something wasn't quite right. And, those are things that we have to deal with. Now, in that particular situation, it was like a social situation, so it wasn't classroom. And so it wasn't expected that the teacher is making these corrective feedback moves, right? But when you're in a classroom, I think there is much more acceptance that the teacher will make these corrective feedback moves and that students will hear it, but they may react a little bit differently depending on their own level of comfort and trust and proficiency. So that's I think we all have to deal with that to some degree. And if we're open to kind of like observing and hearing how individuals feel we're able to make some adjustments, but obviously not as well as if we're on one-on-one, because on one-on-one, that's where you could definitely do your tailoring.
Yeah, Marsha, I can imagine just being in your classroom and thinking, oh my gosh, I better be on my toes because I could be next. I could be the next one to get clobbered with Marsha's constant correction. But, I'm speaking up because I wanted to share something that I've done in my teaching practice, and it's not founded in research, and it's probably just my own innovation, and I can't even speak to how effective it is. But if it is effective, it has to do with this issue of trust and getting students comfortable with feedback and with being corrected. And the way that it works is, if Andy is in my class and she says, oh, I put the dishes on the sink, and I say, in the sink, and Andy says, oh, sorry. And I pick on that word sorry, and I tell my students, from now on, let's just take out the word sorry and let's put in the word thank you. Anytime I give you a correction, you say thank you. And I might have to remind students a couple of times, but they catch on. And then, the words thank you just kind of take over, and the word sorry kind of disappear from the culture of the classroom. And I don't know if it works on them the way it works on me. It kind of gives them a little bit of positive feeling about being corrected, and a positive feeling about making a mistake in the first place. And I hope that's what happens.
Yeah, that's great, because it goes back to an earlier comment I made about saying if you make your classroom a safe place where mistakes are okay. We're all here because we're learning, right? I mean, you wouldn't be in this class if you already knew everything and knew how to do stuff. So make mistakes are okay, and we can all learn from them. So getting over the apology, which is, typically more prevalent in Asian cultures. Sorry, I made another mistake. And if you could dim that down and turn it around as you've done by saying thank you, that would be more on receiving the feedback as something that can propel me toward a better pronunciation.
There's an anonymous question in the Padlet. Is it worth teaching Pratt or Prot to high advanced or low intermediate students? And since I was the one that brought up Prot, I have to apologize and say I have not used Prot. But it is one of the apps that is out there and that is being advocated by some pronunciation teachers. But I don't know if anybody here has used it recently or at all.
I've used it.
What do you think of it? What's your review, Patryk?
Yeah, I think that it's a great tool to use like during the presentation aspect of like teaching prosody. So when I teach pitch and thought groups and prominence, I'll have, I'll record myself and I'll show the students like what the contour, the pitch contour would be. And then I'll have them, if I can work it with a computer lab, then I'll have them use it. I haven't really been able to encourage my students to use it on their own. I think the learning curve is so steep, and it's such an like a technical tool. The pitch contour is so hard to see, really, that I think that it just needs a lot of assistance from the instructor. So I feel like I like it in a really controlled presentation or practice setting, but I can't really imagine giving it like homework. Like, for example, the English Accent Coach, which is another great online pronunciation training tool. I regularly tell my students, okay, so for homework, train levels 3 and 4 and 6 until you get 90% on these 4 vowels. And that's, that the interface is so intuitive, they can do it on their own. So, that's a fantastic tool for students to use on their own. Whereas Pratt, I think, sometimes even like I've used it with recordings of native speakers, and two native speakers saying the same exact thing with what sounds to me like similar accent. You'll have completely different Pratt contours, just because it doesn't pick up every tiny little thing. So I feel like, yeah, great tool, but not necessarily to teach to students how to use on their own, but to incorporate into controlled practice and presentation with, when there's an instructor present.
But it would certainly make more sense to use it with high intermediate or advanced students, and not so much with low intermediate or below.
Oh,
Would
for
you agree?
sure. Yeah. Two things here. Well, it depends on their comfort level with technology. I feel like sometimes we make this assumption that low English level students equate low digital what is that called? Digital literacy, exactly, students, but that's not always the case. I think it could be almost like that assumption could be almost infantilizing in some contexts, like they can't speak English very well, so that probably means that they won't be able to use computer software. So but I would also say that Pratt, I think the best use that I found for it was again to teach students how to use prosody for impact, with imitating TED Talks and things like that, and that usually those are usually those are teaching points that I'd only bring up with like advanced students, grad level students. So yeah, and I mean I agree with you, but maybe not because of just like the high level of digital literacy that's needed for it.
Yeah, I kind of agree with the point you said, Patryk, that it's useful as a way that the teacher feedback can become more enhanced. And that wasn't specifically mentioned in the research that I read, but that's the way I've used those visualizers in the past, whereas mine has been using Audacity, but I don't get as much mileage out of teaching the students to use it and analyze their own speech, but I do get a lot more mileage out of my own use of it to demonstrate certain aspects of feedback as I'm giving the feedback to them.
I have liked to use Audacity, and I've used Audacity both for producing audio files. I use that and GarageBand because I use a Mac. So I use those two to produce files, but I also use the visual aspect to show learners what their speech looks like, because they don't understand when I talk about how they're monotone and they're speaking all of their syllables are the same length, but they can actually see that like this going like compared to mine like this. Whether they're at a lower level or a high level, I have found it very, very useful, because there's something about seeing the spectrogram that helps them identify when I'm telling them, that you're stressing the syllable in this word in the wrong place, or if you're not giving any stress on the focus word. And so that helps quite a bit. Now, I've done a number of presentations on how I'll look it up later. I can't seem to find it right now, but about how we can use Audacity for many purposes, both for recording and having students record on it. I also have done stuff on making your oral comments to students on a second track, or doing modeling on a second track. So the kind of modeling where you are saying what the student said, except for with different prosody or different pausing, or phrase, or even different phonemic sounds, and also the visualization. I work with advanced students who are have been speaking English for decades and speak very fluently, but are not aware of how their prosody is affecting people's hearing. And when they see it in this way on the screen, they can say, ah, that's kind of what you're talking about. They put the words together with the visual. So I like using Audacity. It doesn't have the intonation stuff, which Prot does, but Prot is complicated. So I haven't ever tried to use that for instruction in my case.
Yeah, Marsha, I have used Audacity to talk to students about their linking, and especially, for somebody like Andy who teaches a lot of Vietnamese speakers and a lot of Chinese speaking students, that their syllables can be kind of clipped at the end. And I wish I could demonstrate it right now by sharing a screen or something like that. But if you've ever seen the waveform display on any kind of a sound file, and this is what Audacity looks like in its default display, the string of syllables looks kind of like beads on a string. If you're showing the waveform of a student whose syllables are really clipped and who needs to work on her linking, those beads can be like really far apart from each other on the string. Whereas if I compare that with a native speaker whose syllables are really linked together, they're kind of squished together and they look more like a caterpillar. So, if you can think caterpillar is a good waveform and beads on a string is a bad waveform, you can use that visual aspect just to demonstrate, look, let's get rid of these little gaps in between your syllables.
Well, this has been a very helpful, I think, chance for us to talk about pronunciation and feedback in different ways, different questions that we as learners, our teachers have, what we think about when we're trying to work with our learners. And thanks very much for contributing to our discussion, because without you, it wouldn't be as full as it is now. So I'd just really like to thank everybody for being here and participating in our session. If you're not already a CATESOL member, we encourage you to join. We also are able to provide some information through our Facebook page if you are a Facebook user. We'd like to, again, thank you for your participation in this group. And I hope that you will, if you haven't already done so, that you can join the topic e-list that will allow you not to miss any event, whether you are a member or a non-member. Patryk will send out a notification about our upcoming pronunciation events. And as usual, we invite you to send us any ideas or questions so that we can respond to our interest group, things that are important to you or of interest to you, so we know where to go in the future. For sure and certain, we are going to have some sessions at our state annual conference. We're going to be very excited to get together in person at Pasadena, and that'll be September 29th through October 2nd. You can see our website here. Just go to our catesol.org website and click on the bar that will take us to the conference homepage that gives you all of this information. There are some different pricing, so the earlier you sign up, the less you'll pay. Okay, so we hope to see some of you at this event.